Now, so tonight's webinar is titled Seizing Opportunities in the Water and Environment Sector, a Conversation. And our guest speakers are Professor Carolyn Roberts, a water resource management and science communication specialist, and Catherine Farr, founder of the Community of Women in Water. Carolyn specialises in the impact of human activity on the water cycle and water quality, including the impact of housing, industry, mining and waste disposal, that has wide interests in environmental management. At Oxford University, she directed a national programme that linked industry with researchers to foster the development of innovative environmental technologies. She is also Professor of Environment at Gresham College, London. Catherine founded the Community of Women in Water in 2019 to connect women working in the water sector to help them better address the challenges they face through enhanced networks and knowledge. The Community of Women in Water currently has over 1,000 members globally. Since 2011, Catherine has worked on science policy and programme management. She has conducted water-focused policy and research in the areas of climate change, gender, transboundary, urban resilience, governance, and finance. So at this point, I will pass you over to Carolyn and Catherine for tonight's dialogue.
Thanks so much, Rob. I'm just going to spotlight both of us. How are you, Carolyn? Good.
Hi. Yep.
Yeah,
So
we're all right. Yeah, I'm pretty excited about tonight. So I'm also excited to get asked the first question. So Carolyn, when we talk about meandering careers and seizing opportunities and unique jobs in water, I don't think many people would come up with helping with murder investigations. I certainly hadn't. And I think that sounds really fascinating. I love a good cozy murder mystery, but this is the real thing. So can you share a bit about how you help out with these investigations, how you ended up doing this in addition to all the other work you were doing, what it's really like? I'll pass it over to you.
Yes, well, I need to give you a bit of history here. I started my life as an academic, and after I had I can't remember, one or two children, I started working for a while. I worked part-time, 4 days a week for the university, but I think I got a bit bored, so I started doing some consultancy work on the other day of the week. And I was appearing at a public inquiry to do with sand and gravel extraction, and I was offering expert witness testimony about the effects on the groundwater levels. And I think it was in Leamington. And after I'd finished, there was packing up for the afternoon, and a chap came up to me and said, "Do you know anything about bodies in rivers?" And I said, I know a little bit, because when I'm teaching my students about the sort of hydraulics of rivers, we used to go to the middle reaches of the Severn, and I used to drop a few of them in wetsuits and with life jackets on, and the rest of us would watch to see where they went. I never lost anybody. So I knew a little bit about how it might work, and I gave the chap. I don't think in those days we had business cards. I think I wrote my name on a piece of paper and gave it to him, and thought no more about it. And then the following day, I got a fax, and it turned out this chap was from the Thames Valley Police. And in this fax, I still remember the words he used. He said, "About our body in the river, when can you start? How much will it cost? And do you need to know the weight of the body?" Well, the thing is, he hadn't actually told me what he wanted me to do at all, but I managed to work out that he wanted me to, or they'd found a body, and he wanted to know where it might have come from in a particular time period since the person was last seen. In fact, it wasn't a murder; it was a suicide. This one, very sad, and all of these things are sad. but this was a suicide and it was in the Thames. And so I started collecting some evidence and interviewed lock keepers and looked at the witness statements, and then got some data from the Environment Agency about the flow and established the maximum distance that the person's body could have traveled in the available time. And that's how it got started. And since then, I've never advertised my services, but I've had about 30 cases subsequently, some pretty gruesome. Um, uh, Bodies in suitcases in pieces. As my husband said to me, that's not likely to be suicide then. Parts of bodies, bodies with heads missing. And what I do is try and explore a wide range of evidence. So mostly it's hydrological evidence, and I talk about it as forensic hydrology now because somebody else did. That wasn't my phrase. But so that's how I got into it. It's absolutely fascinating from a science point of view. But on thinking about it, and I'm giving a lecture on this next week, and I was thinking about it earlier today, it's all about trying to work out what might have happened. And almost all the work I do now as a consultant is about what might have happened. So whether it's pollution incidents in rivers, and that's something I'm working on a lot at the moment. I can talk more about that later on. Or bodies in rivers, or changes in river channels, erosion, that kind of thing. It's trying to work out what has happened when you've only got a very limited amount of data, and you've got to put it together into a coherent story. So I suppose the lesson I would say from this is, just go for it. If somebody asks you if you think you can do something, I would suggest people say yes and then work out how to do it later on, and your working life will be very enjoyable, I think, if you do that.
Oh, that's really great. Thank you. And what an amazing story of how you started doing that.
Yes, it was quite a surprise. I mean, this is back in the days when there were faxes. There was no, people didn't use email very much. Certainly, the police didn't, and the technology was a bit ropey as well. Because I can remember interviewing lock keepers on the Thames, and they were marking off the height of the river in 4-inch blocks, and
Yeah.
they called them hands, and I thought, what's that about? It turns out it's related to how you measure the height of a horse. So
Yes.
it's very old fashioned, some of it, and some of the evidence is quite um, partial, let's say, and requires a level of interpretation. But I've only ever done one case abroad. I did one case in Germany, which was associated with the British military and the military police, of a very sad case in which a child is assumed to have fallen into a river and drowned and been washed away in a storm. But so most of the work I've done has been in the UK. But you've worked abroad a lot, Catherine. So why don't you say a little bit about the variety in your career and changing your locations?
Oh yeah, no, I'm happy to share that. So I will start off with I've always really loved to travel. Everyone can probably tell from my accent that I was not born in Britain. I was born in the United States and lived there until about 7.5 years ago. So that's how long I've been in the UK and specifically in London. But before that, when I started out my career, I really wanted to travel and I wanted to get to learn about other cultures. And so I took a job in 2009 teaching procurement software, which was nothing to
No.
do with any of my background, which I had a master's in analytical chemistry. I had a bachelor's in international relations and chemistry. I really wanted to do science policy, but it was a recession and this was a job and it had a couple of things in it. And I said, oh, I could see if I get these skills that I need, maybe I can move into the water sector later. Because at that point, my big goal was not to go back for another degree because I couldn't afford it. And that really worked. And one of the things that is really interesting is as I've worked in the international space, I've got to know people who travel for work, and there are these wonderful jobs that will pay and cover your visa. But it is a real challenge when you go to work internationally, because if you don't already have a right to work, a lot of companies won't cover your visa. In some places, that's just a policy the company has. In some places, they don't know how to do it. And so if you go in and you have that knowledge and you can say, actually, all we need to do is file this paperwork and I can show you how to do it, then sometimes those opportunities open up. But I think what's really interesting is before you think about moving permanently or for a long-term job in another location, because perhaps your company is offering to send you to a new country, I think there are a lot of things that you have to think about, and this comes up in a lot of the conversations that we have in the community of Women in Water, but also in the other work that I do when I mentor younger professionals in the sector. And that's thinking about, what is your motivation for moving abroad? How flexible are you? Because you will be putting yourself in a situation where no one else has your frame of reference. And that can be really exciting, and it will be really frustrating.
What do you mean by that, Catherine? No one else has your frame of reference.
So I'll use a really easy example, maybe. Okay, so in the United States, you should be getting A's in school, right? Those are the top marks. Like, it's not impossible to get top marks, right? So it's the goal is to get a high level, right? The top option. If you are a high performer, that's the grade you should be getting. And when I moved and started working for one of the companies that I did here in England, I got my performance evaluation back. And I was very surprised, because I was like, I have exceeded expectations. That's what I should be getting. That's what everybody should be getting. That's my frame of reference. We should, if I'm doing a good job, I should actually be getting the top. And I luckily chatted with someone who was British and sort of said, like, I'm so confused because I did all of these extra things that I feel should have. And she said, oh no, like one person per department gets that. And I was like, what? She's like, oh yeah, and you can't get it 2 years in a row. And it's, you got the second group. Like that's all you should expect. This is like once in a decade kind of thing. And as an American, I was like, but I'm not doing my job well if I'm not getting in the top section, right? So just my expectations of how people should be seeing my work. Everyone saw my work the same way I did, but how that came out in the evaluation conversation was just very different. So that's what I mean by a bit about the frame of reference.
Okay, so I mean, did you have a long-term career goal? Because certainly I never did. I mean, I've just meandered around really and tried things that I find interesting, but you seem to be much more focused.
Well, I wanted to work on water issues, and I wanted to work on policy. I wanted to work on science policy. And I did not get a PhD in that topic. And I didn't get a master's specifically in water. You can, with a master's in analytical chemistry, pretty easily go into a laboratory and do water quality work. And I had thought about that. But what I found in graduate school is that I really like people. And so what I found was I was sort of trying to figure out, okay, this is my motivation and my passion is I'd like to work with people. I'd like to make a difference. I'd like to work on this topic. I can't go back to school. So what is the pathway that I'm going to take to get there? And when I talk, so I had a lot of informational interviews with people and sort of talked and said, okay, what do you look for? What are the skills that I need to have? And then looking and kind of thinking, do I have those skills? And once I got in the water, once I started working in water policy, I loved it, and I was very happy with my job in the US. But life happened, and I got married and to a Brit, and I moved to the UK, and so then I started off in a whole new place, and I still wanted to do this kind of work. And so, like you, I was looking for what would be interesting, what were the opportunities available in the new country that I was living in, because I couldn't keep my old job.
You still had the strong background in science, though, and
I did.
personally, I think that's very important, whether it's science or engineering or uh, some potentially some social science. But I find when I'm working on wider things, let's say sustainability issues, sometimes that there are people who really I start wincing because they are talking about stuff that's completely beyond what could be understandable in terms of a sort of logical and a rigorous scientific approach. And that makes me nervous, actually, about working with them. And so I think, I think it is quite important to have some kind of, um, as you have, some kind of, let's say, hard science background, so that at least you're not coming into this completely without any understanding of, whether it's atmospheric physics or flows of water or water chemistry. You have a background in chemistry. I have some background in chemistry as well. But I am interested in what you said about you kind of decided you wanted to work on policy, because I found personally that, and it may be an issue of timing, I found that it was quite difficult to have a long-term view. And it might just be the age we are, because I'm a lot older than you. When I started work, which was in the 1980s, well, it's late 70s actually, but I started consultancy work in the 80s. And things did not generally have this very structured arrangements that they have today. So, for example, I did quite a lot of work for public inquiries. I mentioned the one in Leamington, but there was no structured environmental impact assessment paperwork, which today it's I got bored with it, actually, because it became a tick box exercise, and I wanted to do something that was more creative, novel, interesting. And so I'm afraid that's what I did, and moved into new things as well. So did you find the work environment a shock when you moved to the UK, or was it a pleasant surprise? I mean, you mentioned that you were a bit disturbed by not always hitting 100%.
No, and I use that sort of as a lighthearted example, because I know that in the schools here, right, the grading is different. And that obviously you'd expect that performance evaluations would more match what you'd have at a school. And so I I've actually been very happy with the work environment. I don't know that it's that different from what I did expect. I did expect I find that people here are a little bit more modest, a little bit very, very thoughtful, very interested in the work they're doing. But I've also worked on a lot of international teams while I've been here, and so I'm still getting to sort of learn more from other cultures, and not just here.
So we've got listening into our webinar today, we've got some people who are a long way from being early career, but we have got some early career people. And would you advise them to contemplate working abroad? Would you encourage them? Would you say be cautious? How does
No, I would encourage them, and we actually got to talking so much about the UK that I didn't mention that I lived for a year volunteering in the Middle East. So that was the very big different culture. But I've learned so much from working abroad. And I also think that there are different points in your career where it's a lot easier for you to move abroad and take those opportunities, whether it's a 6-month research stint for a bigger project. All I was trying to say is it is hard to move to a country without a right to work and find something in the time frame that you have. That if that's what you want to do, you've got to really think it through, make the contacts before you move, talk to people if you can, go out for a week and have pre-set up meetings and try to understand what it would take to move there and make sure that you really want that. Because if you're not motivated to stay, it might just be a bit of a challenge. If you're lucky enough to get to travel or do a stint with a company that you're already with, I think that's a lot easier, and I would jump at those opportunities. I think they're wonderful.
Can we talk a bit about working with government agencies? Because I think you've done that as well,
I've done a
and
little bit
in
of
the
that.
private
Yes.
sector.
Yes.
I mean, I've also worked with government agencies and had a mixed experience of that. Um, as Rob said when he was introducing us, I worked for part of Innovate UK, which is the government's innovation agency. And in fact, I still work for them, but now as an independent consultant. But I found working for them brought me into contact with some very interesting people in business and in universities and in government departments. But actually, there were quite a lot of constraints on what you could and couldn't do, which I thought were rather limiting in terms of the beneficial impact you might have on let's genuinely have on the environment, broadly speaking. I don't know what you feel about that. Who did you work for that was at the public sector organization?
So I've worked with the US government more than the UK government. I've got contacts at FCDO that I've, tangentially worked with. We've, collaborated, but it's much more of a broad coalition kind of meeting thing. So it was the USAID and the US State Department. And I found it really interesting because I was working on transboundary water issues, and so did come in contact with diplomats from other countries as well. And I found that's a really interesting world. And as you said, it can feel quite limiting, particularly publicly, what you're allowed to say, what you can say, um, what depending on the different countries. So in the US, there's the Hatch Act. So if you are representing the government, you can only publicly espouse government views. You don't have personal views, and that can be challenging for people. But I also find that the governments are in a very unique position, and a lot of the civil servants are there because they are passionate about the work. They do care about it, and so at least the ones that I've worked with have really cared about
Give us,
the work.
can you be very specific, Catherine? When you were working in the US government, what exactly were you doing?
So I was a program manager within the Office of Oceans International Affairs and Science. So there's a science bureau, and I was a contractor within this team that worked on water programs. And so I was managing some of the projects that some of the State Department money went to. For example, in the Shared Waters Partnership, which was with UNDP and SEWI, the Stockholm International Environment Institute.
And what was that
Water
project trying to
Institute.
do?
So they were working on trying to help transboundary water challenges in the Nile and the Mekong, and trying to understand what how can we all better increase our water security in those regions, and helping bring the diplomats from those countries together.
So this is a very pointed question, it sounds like now, from my point of view, because what I was about to say was, so why is the American government looking at transboundary water issues in Egypt and the Sudan and whatever? I mean, what are they offering research support, or are they trying to tell the Egyptians and the Sudanese and whatever Rwandans how to manage
No,
this?
I think that it's just about water security is global security, and the focus on the program was to build the knowledge. As you were saying earlier, there's such a technical level of knowledge that is needed to be working on these issues. And so it was simply a capacity building program that was initiated by these other organizations, and CEDA and other international donors were funding the project.
So you're
it was,
training people
yeah, it
in
was,
those
yes.
countries.
Yeah, but again, the government wasn't training it. It's just like you would normally have a lot of organization, a lot of governments coming together and saying, this is a worthwhile pursuit. We want to make sure that people have the capacity they need, and we'll be running that program accordingly. So again, it wasn't the State Department running the program, it's just one of the funders.
And so what about climate change? Were you involved in
Not
US
when I was
policy
there.
on climate change? No.
No, so my time working on climate change is when I was at WaterAid and when I was at the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, and that was looking at climate impacts on water sanitation and hygiene when I was at WaterAid, and climate impacts and adaptation needs for water resources when I was with Agua.
Because clearly that kind of issue, and indeed some of the work that I'm doing at the moment, there's a big political agenda which you need to be aware of. I mean, I don't know, when you were working with the US government, I think there was a climate change policy. Now there isn't. It appears that there isn't. And in my case, I've been doing work on water quality, where policy's been, not, in my opinion, not very well not very well policed, let's say. But there's a very strong political dimension, and there are public views to take into account, as well as the science views. I find it's important to keep a strong line on the science, but I don't know what you would say about that.
No, I do think the science is important. A lot of the work that I have done with climate change is trying to raise awareness of why water matters. There's such a focus on the emissions, and that being the kind of the key driver, because it's easy to understand, right, Carolyn? It's so easy to go, oh, the emissions are up, oh, the emissions are down. But when you start talking about water, it's, well, what is the quality? Well, what is the availability? Well, this isn't about how much rainwater we get for the year. It's a question of, when is the water? Is it coming at the time that the crops need it? Is it coming too early? Is it going to flood the crops? Is it going to come too late? Is the harvest going to be dry? Because a lot of the climate models will tell you, oh, you're fine. You're getting the same amount of rainwater all year. And you're like, yes, but per year, that doesn't tell communities what they need to know. And a lot of the climate models aren't localized enough. And water is a very localized issue. And so you're not getting the data out to people that they need to know. And then there are lots of challenges around, how do you get that data out to local farmers and communities? What does that look like? Who needs to be considered when you're making policies around this? Because water is used differently by different groups, and a lot of times industry and agriculture are sort of the primary focuses of policies, right? The agricultural department will come out and say, we are going to do this, and it will need this, and this is how we're going to solve climate change. But then they won't go to the they won't think about the other water users. And so you might end up with climate policy planning that sort of uses 180% of the water available that we have now.
Yeah, that's not helpful, is it?
Even thinking about what'll be in the future. No, it's not very helpful. So just a sort of illustrative point for maybe people on the call who aren't as familiar with why you need the science. I was just trying to give an example of, you really do need to be able to think through these things and see the connections. But Caroline, sorry, I feel like we've gone down a rabbit hole of asking lots of questions about me, which I'm happy to answer, of course. But we did want to make sure, because this was focused on young professionals, that we got back to you and talking about your academic experiences. And I was really interested when you said that you also didn't have a PhD, because that's always been a kind of question point for me. Should I have gone back? Oh, I looked at this job. Oh, it needed one, but maybe I should have. But I'm very happy with kind of the path that I've taken. So I'm really curious, what about you? Has it worked out for you with that one?
I'm really embarrassed, because I did 3 years research and then didn't write it up. I published quite a bit of it. It was on the impact of hydrological change on river channels. So it was the intersection of hydrology with geomorphology and geology. But I got it was a time of recession when I finished, and I had 2 years on fixed term contracts in a university, and then those ended, and my husband had a similar experience with one year. He's a historian, and so we were in the middle of a recession, casting round, and I got a job in what was a very small college and I had a very high teaching load to start off with, and there really wasn't time to do research to finish it off. So I managed to publish a few articles, but I am quite embarrassed about not finishing my thesis, and actually have come back to it recently and thought perhaps I could actually do something, because it's actually still of interest. It was looking at the effects of building urbanization on river channels, and actually it's a direct mirror of what's happening with climate change and river channels, and actually you could take the same statistical work and just reapply it to the new situation, but I haven't done that yet. So I as I say, then I started working on a whole lot of what I saw interesting projects, and my butterfly mind took me to other places. I mean, it's taken me into all sorts of interesting places. I mean, you were talking about water, the effect of climate change in water. In 2007, there were some very large floods in England, in Gloucestershire, and I was asked to be an advisor to the county council, that's the local authority, when they were trying to sort out what had happened. And that was an absolutely fascinating experience. Again, I said, yes, I can help with that. And it involved like a public inquiry where different organizations were brought in, the heads of these things were brought in and cross-examined. So the flooding was massive, and it wasn't just the fact that hundreds, if not thousands, of properties were inundated, but hundreds of thousands of people lost their water supplies and electricity supplies for, in the case of water, anything up to 3 weeks. Now, you've talked about rural areas. I'm talking about cities, or these very large towns. If you lose your water supply, and more significantly, you lose your sanitation, you're quickly back to medieval circumstances, and you are on the brink of what the police would call civil unrest. Mm-hmm. And that is, in fact, what happened. There wasn't widespread civil unrest, but there was certainly some violence and some very sharp interchanges. And bringing people in to talk about that in a public forum, we produced a report, and that went on to inform Sir Michael Pitt's review of flooding that was done after the 2007 floods, which became national policy. And in some of the places in that report, our text has been imported without acknowledgement, I should say. Yeah, I mean, so that's interesting as perhaps another example of seizing the moment, which is what I like to do. If I'd known when I started what I was going to get into, I probably wouldn't have done it. I might have been a bit more cautious, but I found it interesting, and I'd be advising other people to do that as well. You never know when that kind of experience is going to become relevant, and it certainly has become relevant in later projects that I've undertaken. Yeah,
I think that's really great. I know that we had wanted to make sure we had lots of time to open the floor for questions. I've still got more questions for you, but I will go. I know we said we were going to stop the recording now, just so that people can feel free with their questions and us with our answers. So